Sarah Chen stared at her phone's calculator for the fifth time, her hands trembling as she rechecked the numbers. The small break room at Megamart felt even more suffocating than usual as she compared her hours worked against her latest paycheck. Something wasn't adding up, and it hadn't been for the past 3 months. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Sarah pulled out her small blue notebook where she had meticulously recorded every shift since starting her job 6 months ago. As a high school senior working to save money for college, she had developed a habit of writing down her clock in and clock out times, something her mother had taught her to do. "Always keep track of your work, Sarah," her mother's words echoed in her mind. "No one else will do it for you." The discrepancy started small, just 30 minutes missing here and there. But as Sarah flipped through her notebook, the pattern became clear. Her overtime hours were vanishing from her paychecks, and the missing time now added up to nearly 40 hours of unpaid work. The next morning, Sarah arrived early for her shift, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. She waited outside Mr. Thompson's office, the store manager who always wore the same navy blue tie and permanently bored expression. When he finally arrived, coffee in hand, he barely acknowledged her presence. "Mr. Thompson, could I speak with you for a moment?" Sarah's voice was steady, despite her racing heart. "Make it quick, Chen. Morning rush starts in 20 minutes. He didn't even look up from his phone. Inside his office, Sarah carefully laid out her evidence, her notebook, photographs of the time clock records, and her paychecks. She explained the missing hours, pointing to specific dates and times. Mr. Thompson's expression remained unchanged, as if she were telling him about the weather. "Must be a computer glitch," he said dismissively. "I'll look into it." But weeks passed and nothing changed. Sarah sent emails, left voicemails, and even tried speaking to the district manager during his monthly visit. Each attempt was met with the same response: vague promises and no action. The situation began affecting her schoolwork. She stayed up late documenting everything, taking photos of her time cards, and researching labor laws online. Her best friend Jenny noticed the dark circles under her eyes during lunch period. "Sarah, this isn't right," Jenny said, pushing her untouched sandwich aside. "My cousin works at a law firm. Maybe she can help." But Sarah hesitated. Megamart was owned by Marcus Sterling, one of the richest men in the country. His face was everywhere, on business magazines, local news, and even their school's new library bore his name after a generous donation. One rainy evening, while organizing shopping carts in the parking lot, Sarah overheard two senior cashiers talking. Their words made her freeze. "It's happening again," one whispered. "Just like at the other stores. They target the teenage workers because they think we're too scared to speak up." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She thought about her mother, who worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat after moving to America. She thought about her younger sister, who would soon be old enough to start working too. If no one stood up now, how many other young workers would face the same treatment? The next morning, Sarah made 2 decisions. First, she started recording every conversation with management on her phone. Second, she began asking other teenage coworkers about their paychecks. The responses shocked her. Maria from the grocery department was missing hours. Jason from electronics had overtime that vanished. Even quiet Peter from the stockroom admitted his paycheck never matched his actual hours. When Sarah compiled all the information, her hands shook. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was systematic, a deliberate scheme targeting the youngest, most vulnerable workers at Megamart. The final straw came when Mr. Thompson called her into his office 1 month later. Instead of addressing her complaints, he reduced her hours, claiming budget cuts. The message was clear: keep quiet or face consequences. That evening, Sarah sat at her small desk, surrounded by months of evidence. Her mother was working the night shift at the hospital, and her sister was already asleep. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the heating system. She opened her laptop and typed, "How to file a lawsuit against an employer." As the search results loaded, Sarah took a deep breath. She was only 17, but she knew this was bigger than her fear. Someone had to take the first step, and she was ready to be that person. What she didn't know was that her simple search would unravel a secret that would shock not just her community, but the entire nation. The fluorescent lights of Lincoln High School's guidance office made everything look harsh and unflattering, but Ms. Rodriguez's warm smile made Sarah feel slightly more at ease. It had taken her 3 days to work up the courage to seek help, and now she sat nervously clutching her folder of evidence. "Let me get this straight," Ms. Rodriguez said, adjusting her reading glasses as she examined Sarah's meticulous records. "You documented every missing hour, every conversation, and even have recordings." Sarah nodded, watching as her counselor's expression changed from concern to determination. Ms. Rodriguez had always been known as the teacher who fought for her students, but what she said next surprised Sarah. "My brother Marco is a lawyer. He specializes in labor law and takes on cases like this pro bono. That means free of charge," Ms. Rodriguez explained, already reaching for her phone. "Would you be willing to meet with him?" 2 days later, Sarah found herself in a modest office downtown. Marco Rodriguez's office wasn't fancy like the law firms she'd seen on TV. The furniture was worn, and the walls were covered with newspaper clippings about various cases he won for ordinary people. "Sarah, what you brought me isn't just about missing overtime," Marco said, spreading her documents across his desk. "This is systematic wage theft, and it's illegal." He paused, running a hand through his graying hair. "But here's what you need to understand. Going up against Marcus Sterling won't be easy. Are you sure you want to do this?" Sarah thought about her coworkers: Maria, who was saving for her mother's medical bills; Jason, who needed money for his college application fees; and Peter, who helped support his younger siblings. She straightened her shoulders and nodded. What happened next moved faster than Sarah expected. Marco began investigating other Megamart locations, and the responses flooded in. Through social media and word of mouth, teenage workers from across the state started reaching out. Each had similar stories: missing hours, altered time cards, and intimidation from management. Jenny, Sarah's best friend, became her unofficial assistant, helping organize the incoming information. They created a spreadsheet tracking every complaint, every piece of evidence. The numbers were staggering: hundreds of teenage workers affected, thousands of stolen hours. "Sarah," Marco called one evening, his voice excited, "we just heard from a store in Phoenix, then another in Denver. This isn't just happening in our state, it's nationwide." The lawsuit was filed on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, local news vans were parked outside Lincoln High School. Sarah's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from reporters and other workers wanting to join the case. Mr. Thompson, the store manager, suddenly became very interested in fixing the computer glitch he dismissed months ago. But it was too late. The story had taken on a life of its own. The real shock came when Rachel Torres, a former HR director at Megamart's corporate office, contacted Marco. She had been fired 6 months ago after questioning the company's labor practices. "I have something you need to see," Rachel said during their meeting, pulling out a USB drive. This software wasn't a glitch. It was designed specifically to target workers under 18. The system automatically shaves minutes off their shifts, rounds down their hours, and deletes overtime. And I can prove Marcus Sterling himself approved it. Sarah watched as Marco reviewed the files, his expression growing more serious with each click. The evidence was damning: internal emails, software specifications, and financial reports showing millions saved through systematic wage theft. That night, as Sarah sat at her kitchen table doing homework, her mother came home from her nursing shift. She noticed the dark circles under her daughter's eyes and the stack of legal papers beside her textbooks. "Are you sure about this, Sarah?" her mother asked softly. "These are powerful people you're challenging." Sarah showed her mother the latest update. Over 3,000 teenage workers had now joined the lawsuit. Their stories were all similar: dreams of college, helping their families, saving for their futures, all while having their hard-earned wages stolen. "Someone has to stand up, Mom," Sarah replied. "If not me, then who?" What Sarah didn't know was that Marcus Sterling had already called an emergency board meeting. In his penthouse office overlooking the city, he stared at Sarah's photo on his computer screen, his face pale. There was something about her that seemed hauntingly familiar, something that stirred a memory he tried very hard to forget. The stage was set for a battle that would become much more personal than anyone could have imagined. Marcus Sterling's office on the 50th floor of the Sterling Tower was a monument to his success. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city he seemed to own piece by piece. But today, the billionaire wasn't admiring the view. Instead, he stared at the stack of newspapers on his desk, all featuring the same headline about the lawsuit. His empire had started 30 years ago with a single discount store. Now, Megamart had over 200 locations across the country. The media called him a self-made success story, but the truth hiding behind the glossy magazine covers was far uglier. "Sir, the board members are waiting," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. In the boardroom, 12 nervous executives sat around a massive mahogany table. The latest financial reports were projected on the wall, showing how the company had saved $43 million over the past 5 years through what they politely called labor cost optimization. How did this happen? Sterling's voice was quiet but filled with rage. How did a teenage cashier manage to expose our entire operation? The head of it, James Chen, no relation to Sarah, cleared his throat. "The software worked perfectly, Mr. Sterling. It was designed to be untraceable. We called it Project Midnight. It automatically adjusted time cards for workers under 18. 10 minutes here, 15 minutes there. Small enough that most wouldn't notice." "But she did notice," Sterling snapped. "And now we have a PR nightmare and a class action lawsuit on our hands." As the meeting continued, Rachel Torres, a whistleblowing former HR director, was sharing more damaging information with Marco Rodriguez. She revealed how Sterling had specifically chosen store locations in working-class neighborhoods, knowing teenage workers there would be less likely to complain about missing wages. He called it strategic workforce management, Rachel explained, her voice bitter. But it was pure exploitation. The software was just the tip of the iceberg. Back at the Sterling Tower, the billionaire's carefully constructed world was beginning to crack. His phone wouldn't stop ringing, investors wanting answers, reporters seeking comments, board members threatening to resign. In his private bathroom, Sterling splashed cold water on his face and stared at his reflection. The young man who had once worked as a store clerk himself was long gone, replaced by someone who had lost his way in the pursuit of wealth. Meanwhile, federal investigators had begun examining Megamart's financial records. What they found was shocking. The wage theft scheme wasn't just targeting current workers. It went back years, affecting thousands of former employees. "Look at this," one investigator said to another, pointing at his screen. "They even had a scoring system. Stores got bonuses for keeping labor costs low. Managers were promoted based on how much money they could save on teenage workers' wages. The investigation revealed a complex web of fraud. Sterling hadn't just stolen wages. He had avoided millions in taxes, manipulated stock prices, and used the stolen money to fund his lavish lifestyle. Sarah's lawsuit had accidentally pulled on a thread that was now unraveling Sterling's entire empire. His $4.2 billion fortune was built on the stolen dreams of young workers who had trusted his company to treat them fairly. At home, Sterling poured himself a drink and opened an old file on his laptop. Inside was a folder labeled Personnel Records, 2008. He scrolled through until he found what he was looking for, a photograph of a former housekeeper. His hand trembled as he looked at her face, then at a recent photo of Sarah Chen from the news. The resemblance was undeniable. Across town, Sarah sat in Marco's office, listening as he explained the latest developments. The case had grown beyond wage theft. Federal agencies were now involved, investigating everything from tax fraud to securities violations. "Sarah, what you started, it's much bigger than we thought," Marco said, showing her the preliminary findings. Sterling didn't just steal from teenagers. He built his entire business on fraud and exploitation. Outside Marco's office window, the sun was setting behind the Sterling Tower, its shadows stretching across the city like a dark reminder of its owner's deeds. Sarah watched as the last rays of sunlight reflected off the building's glass surface, making it glow like fool's gold. What no one knew yet was that the biggest revelation was still to come. A secret that would connect Sarah to Marcus Sterling in a way that would shock everyone involved in the case. Janet Martinez had worked at Megamart's corporate headquarters for 15 years before becoming HR director. Now, sitting in her small apartment surrounded by boxes of documents, she knew she had to make a choice that would change everything. The manila envelope on her coffee table contained what she called her insurance policy, documents she'd secretly copied before Sterling fired her. For 6 months, she debated what to do with them. When she saw Sarah Chen on the news, she knew it was time. "This is everything," Janet told Marco Rodriguez, laying out the documents on his desk. "Employee records, internal memos, and emails going back 10 years. But the most important thing is this. She pulled out a red USB drive. Sterling's personal instructions for the wage theft program. Marco leaned forward, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he examined an email dated 3 years ago. It was from Sterling himself, outlining exactly how he wanted the software to work. Target the young ones, Sterling had written. They don't know their rights, and their parents are too busy working to notice. Keep the deduction small. Death by 1,000 cuts is better than one big slash. Janet's hands shook as she continued her story. I was there when he pitched it to the board. He said it was brilliant because teenagers wouldn't fight back. He called them easy targets. As Janet spoke, Sarah sat quietly in the corner of Marco's office, recording everything. Her presence made Janet nervous. There was something about the girl that nagged at her memory, but she couldn't quite place it. Sterling has a pattern, Janet explained. Every few years, he opens new stores in neighborhoods where families are struggling. He offers jobs to their kids, knowing they need the money too badly to complain about missing hours. The evidence Janet brought was damning. There were spreadsheets showing how much each store saved through wage theft, congratulatory emails to managers who successfully kept labor costs low, and even a training manual teaching supervisors how to intimidate young workers who asked questions about their paychecks. But there was more. 2 weeks before he fired me, Janet said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, I found something else. Sterling had a special file encrypted on his personal server. It contained records of payments made to former employees, huge payments, with strict confidentiality agreements. Marco's eyes narrowed. Hush money? Janet nodded. One name kept appearing in his private emails, Elena Chen. He paid her almost $1 million 15 years ago to disappear. At the mention of this name, Sarah's head snapped up. Elena Chen was her mother's name. Before anyone could react to this revelation, Janet pulled out one final document. This is what got me fired. It's a photo from the company's 20th anniversary party, taken in 2008. Look at the woman standing behind Sterling. The photograph showed a younger Marcus Sterling, surrounded by employees. And there, partially hidden in the background, was a woman who looked exactly like Sarah. The office fell silent. Sarah stared at the photo, her hands trembling. The woman was her mother, 15 years younger, wearing a Megamart uniform. Your mother worked for Sterling? Marco asked gently. Sarah shook her head slowly. She never told me. She just said she used to work as a housekeeper for a wealthy family before I was born. Janet's face paled as the pieces started falling into place. That's why he looked so shocked when your lawsuit made the news. That's why he's been acting strange in board meetings whenever your name comes up. Marco quickly pulled out his phone and started making notes. We need to look into these payments, trace where they went. If Sterling was paying off former employees. But Janet cut him off. It's not just about the payments. Look at the dates. Alana Chen disappeared in 2008. Sarah was born in 2007. The implications hung heavy in the air. Sarah felt the room spinning as she tried to process what this might mean. There's one more thing, Janet said, reaching into her bag. I found this in Sterling's private files. It's a birthday card, never sent, dated 15 years ago. It's addressed to a baby girl. As Marco read the card, his face grew serious. The message inside was simple but devastating. To my daughter. I'm sorry I can't be there. Your trust fund will be waiting when you turn 21. MS. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. The lawsuit she'd filed over stolen wages had just uncovered something far more personal, a secret that would shake the Sterling empire to its core. The county courthouse was packed on the first day of the trial. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras forbidden inside but their notebooks ready. Marcus Sterling sat at the defense table, wearing an expensive gray suit that couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders. Sarah Chen walked in with Marco Rodriguez, trying to appear confident despite her racing heart. She wore her mother's blue blazer, the one Elena Chen had worn to her citizenship ceremony years ago. It felt like armor. Judge Patricia Henderson looked over her reading glasses at the crowded courtroom. At 72, she had seen many cases, but none quite like this. A teenage cashier taking on one of the country's richest men was unprecedented. Your Honor, Sterling's lead attorney, Richard Walsh, began smoothly. This case is built on misunderstandings and exaggerations. Miss Chen simply doesn't understand how modern payroll systems work. Marco stood up, his voice steady. What Miss Chen understands perfectly well, Your Honor, is basic math. And the math shows that Megamart systematically stole wages from thousands of teenage workers. The first witness was Maria Garcia, Sarah's former co-worker. Her hands shook as she described how her missing wages meant she couldn't help pay for her mother's medicine. Sterling watched her testimony with an unreadable expression. Miss Garcia, Walsh approached her during cross-examination. Isn't it possible you simply forgot to clock in properly? Made mistakes in your calculations? Maria's voice grew stronger. No, sir. I took photos of every time card. The hours disappeared after they went into the system. Throughout the morning, more teenage workers testified. Each story was similar: missing hours, ignored complaints, threats of reduced shifts if they pressed the issue. Sterling's lawyers tried to discredit each one, suggesting they were confused or dishonest. Then Janet Martinez took the stand. Mr. Sterling personally approved Project Midnight, she testified, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. He called it his teenage tax, a way to boost profits by stealing small amounts from workers too young to fight back. Sterling's face darkened. His lawyers huddled together, whispering urgently. They hadn't known about Janet's evidence until now. During the lunch break, Marco received an unexpected message. A former Megamart worker wanted to testify. He had helped design the software that altered time cards and couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Back in session, Sarah took the stand. She spoke clearly about discovering the missing wages, documenting everything, and trying to resolve it through proper channels. But when Marco showed her the photo Janet had provided, the one of her mother at the company party, Sterling suddenly stood up. Your Honor, I need a brief recess, he said, his voice strained. The judge noted his unusual behavior but granted 15 minutes. In the hallway, Walsh confronted Sterling. Is there something about this girl you haven't told us? Sterling loosened his tie, looking older than his 60 years. Handle the case, he muttered, walking away. The afternoon brought the worker's testimony. He explained in detail how the software worked, showing actual code that proved it was designed to target young workers. Sterling's defense began to crumble. The system was created to be invisible, the worker explained. But Sarah Chen did something no one expected. She kept her own records and trusted her math over the computer. As the day drew to a close, Judge Henderson reviewed the evidence. Thousands of altered time cards, internal emails proving intent, testimony from workers and whistleblowers. But it was Sarah's careful documentation that tied everything together. Sterling sat alone at his table, his legal team frantically preparing for the next day. He kept glancing at Sarah, sitting with her mother who had finally come to court. Alana Chen refused to meet his eyes. The judge's voice cut through the tension. We'll resume tomorrow at 9 a.m., and Mr. Sterling, she added, I expect you to be prepared to testify. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Sarah and Marco, but Sarah's attention was on her mother, who stood quietly at the bottom of the courthouse steps, clutching her purse tightly. Mom, Sarah said softly, we need to talk about the photo, about Sterling, about why you never told me. Alina Chen looked at her daughter, tears in her eyes. Yes, she whispered, it's time you knew everything. What no one in the courtroom realized was that tomorrow's testimony would reveal not just corporate fraud, but a personal story that would change both Sarah and Sterling's lives forever. Martha Williams had worked as a clerk at the county courthouse for 32 years. She'd seen thousands of faces come and go, but something about this case caught her attention. During the lunch break, she sat at her desk, staring at an old file from 2008 that she pulled from the archives. The Megamart trial was in its second day when Martha noticed something odd. Every time Sarah Chen spoke, Marcus Sterling's face showed more than just worry about the lawsuit. There was recognition, pain, and something that looked like fear. I've seen that look before, Martha muttered to herself, remembering a late-night filing 15 years ago. She opened the dusty file from 2008, and her eyes widened. Inside the courthouse, the trial continued. Sterling's lawyers called expert after expert, trying to explain away the wage theft as computer errors. But Sarah sat calmly, watching as each explanation fell apart under Marco's cross-examination. During a brief recess, Martha approached Marco in the hallway. Her hands trembled as she held the old file. "Mr. Rodriguez," she whispered, "there's something you need to see. It's about your client and Mr. Sterling. I found a sealed court order from 2008. Marco followed Martha to her office, where she carefully opened the file. Inside was a confidentiality agreement, signed by Elena Chen, along with a series of payments authorized by Marcus Sterling. But it was the attached birth certificate that made Marco's breath catch. Back in the courtroom, Sterling was finally called to testify. As he walked to the witness stand, his eyes briefly met Sarah's. The teenager felt a strange shiver, as if something unspoken passed between them. "Mr. Sterling," Marco began his questioning, "when did you first hear about Sarah Chen's complaints?" Sterling gripped the witness stand. "When the lawsuit was filed," he lied. "Really?" Marco held up a document. "Then why did you access her employee file 20 times in the month before she filed suit?" The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Sterling's lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I review many employee files," Sterling said weakly. "Do you also make secret payments to former housekeepers?" Marco asked suddenly. The question hung in the air like a thundercloud. Sterling's face went pale. In the gallery, Elena Chen stood up, her hands shaking. "Objection!" Sterling's lawyers shouted. "Relevance!" But Judge Henderson leaned forward, intrigued. "I'll allow it. The witness will answer." Before Sterling could speak, Martha Williams slipped into the courtroom and handed a note to the judge. After reading it, Judge Henderson called both legal teams to her chambers immediately. In the nearly empty courtroom, Sarah sat alone, watching Sterling. He hadn't moved from the witness stand, as if frozen in place. For the first time, she noticed they had the same shaped hands, the same way of tilting their head when thinking. 20 minutes later, everyone returned. The judge's face was grave. "In light of new evidence," she announced, "this court is calling a 3-day recess. When we resume, we will be addressing not only the wage theft allegations but also certain personal matters that have come to light." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed as Marco huddled with Sarah and her mother. Elena was crying softly as she finally began to tell her story. "I worked as his housekeeper in 2007, she explained. "He was different then, kinder. When I told him I was pregnant," she couldn't continue. Sarah sat stunned as the truth emerged. The sealed court documents showed that Sterling had paid Elena to leave town and stay quiet. He had been married then, in the middle of a big business deal. A scandal would have ruined everything. "He's my father," Sarah whispered, the words feeling strange in her mouth. Marco nodded grimly. "And according to these papers, he set up a trust fund for you. Money you were supposed to receive when you turned 21. The irony was bitter. A billionaire who had stolen wages from thousands of teenage workers, including his own unacknowledged daughter. That evening, Martha Williams watched from her office window as Sarah and Elena left the courthouse. She saw Sterling watching them too, from his car across the street, looking lost and old. "Secrets always find their way out," Martha said to herself, closing the old file. "One way or another, the truth comes to light." The wage theft trial had unexpectedly unearthed the 15-year-old secret that would change everything. When court resumed in 3 days, it wouldn't just be Megamart's future at stake, but the personal legacy of Marcus Sterling himself. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when the trial resumed 3 days later. Inside, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table, her mother beside her, both women wearing identical expressions of determination. Marcus Sterling entered through a side door, looking like he aged years in just 3 days. The media had been relentless since the DNA test results leaked. Headlines screaming about the billionaire who stole wages from his own daughter. Judge Henderson called the court to order. "Before we proceed, Mr. Sterling has requested to make a statement." Sterling walked slowly to the front of the courtroom. For the first time in his life, he wasn't wearing an expensive suit. Instead, he wore a simple gray sweater that made him look more like a tired father than a corporate titan. 15 years ago, he began, his voice shaking, "I made the worst decision of my life. I chose my company's reputation over my own child. I paid Elena Chen to disappear, thinking money could solve everything." The courtroom was silent as he continued. "Then, through some twisted fate, the daughter I abandoned ended up working at one of my stores. And what did I do? I stole from her, just like I stole from thousands of other young workers. Sarah watched him, her face unreadable. Elena squeezed her daughter's hand. The wage theft program wasn't a computer glitch, Sterling admitted. I approved it. I encouraged it. I rewarded managers who implemented it. We targeted teenage workers because we thought they were powerless. Marco stood up. Your Honor, we'd like to enter Mr. Sterling's confession into the record. But Sterling wasn't finished. He turned to face Sarah directly. I've spent 15 years trying to forget about the baby I abandoned. I built this empire by exploiting young people like you, telling myself it was just business. But when I saw your name on that lawsuit, when I saw your face, his voice broke. The judge called a brief recess. During the break, Janet Martinez approached Marco with more documents. We found everything, she said. All the hidden accounts, all the families he paid off. Sarah wasn't the only one he tried to erase. When court resumed, the full scope of Sterling's deceptions became clear. The wage theft scheme had stolen over $43 million from teenage workers. But there were also dozens of confidentiality agreements, millions paid to hide various corporate misdeeds. Mr. Sterling, Marco asked during cross-examination, how many other children have you paid to forget? Sterling's lawyers objected, but the damage was done. The jury saw the truth. A man who had built his fortune by betraying not just his workers, but his own flesh and blood. Elena finally took the stand. She described working as Sterling's housekeeper, their brief relationship, and his reaction when she told him she was pregnant. He offered me money to go away, she said softly. I took it because I was scared and alone in a new country. But I never spent it. I saved it all for Sarah's college fund. The DNA results were entered into evidence, though they were hardly needed now. The resemblance between Sarah and Sterling was obvious to everyone in the courtroom. During the final day of testimony, an unexpected witness appeared, Sterling's ex-wife, Catherine. She testified about other hidden payments, other secrets she discovered during their marriage. The wage theft wasn't just about money, she revealed. It was about power. Marcus needed to prove he could control people's lives. As the trial neared its end, Sarah asked to address the court. She stood tall, her voice steady. I filed this lawsuit because what Megamart did was wrong, she said. I didn't know I was fighting my own father, but now that I do, I understand something important. No amount of money can fix broken trust. The jury took only 4 hours to reach their verdict. They found Megamart guilty of systematic wage theft and ordered the company to pay $300 million in damages and back wages. But the real judgment came in the form of public opinion. Sterling's empire began to crumble as investors fled and customers boycotted. The man who had spent his life accumulating wealth had lost something far more valuable: his reputation, his legacy, and any chance of knowing his daughter. As Sarah left the courthouse that final day, reporters asked how it felt to be a millionaire's daughter. She looked back at the building where her father sat alone. I'm not a millionaire's daughter, she replied. I'm Elena Chen's daughter, and that's worth more than all of Sterling's money. The truth had finally come out, but some wounds were too deep to heal with just a verdict. 6 months after the verdict, Sarah Chen stood at a podium in front of the newly established Young Workers' Rights Foundation. The building, ironically, was a converted Megamart store that had closed after the scandal. When I first noticed missing hours on my paycheck, I never imagined where it would lead, she told the crowd. Today, we're turning a symbol of exploitation into a center for hope. The foundation, funded by Sarah's portion of the settlement money, had already helped thousands of teenage workers understand their rights. Elena Chen sat in the front row, beaming with pride at her daughter. Marcus Sterling watched the ceremony from his car across the street. His empire had crumbled spectacularly in the aftermath of the trial. Megamart filed for bankruptcy, its stores either closing or being sold off to competitors. The board had forced him to resign, and federal investigators were still combing through decades of financial records. Inside the foundation, Sarah had created something remarkable. There was a legal aid clinic where young workers could get free advice, an education center teaching financial literacy, and a support network for whistleblowers. The settlement checks have been sent to over 40,000 former Megamart teenage workers. Marco Rodriguez announced to applause. But more importantly, our case has sparked investigations into wage theft at other major retailers. Janet Martinez, Now the Foundation's head of research had compiled data showing similar patterns at dozens of other companies. Her work was leading to industry-wide reforms in how young workers were treated. Sarah's story had become a symbol of hope for young workers across the country. She was invited to speak at schools, appeared before Congress, and helped draft new legislation protecting teenage employees. One afternoon, as Sarah was leaving the Foundation, she found Sterling waiting by her car. "You've done good work here," he said quietly. "Better than anything I ever built." Sarah studied the man who was her biological father. He looked older, humbled. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by casual clothes that made him look more human. "I didn't do it to hurt you," she said. "I did it because it was right." Sterling nodded. "I know. You're a better person than I ever was." He handed her an envelope. "This is the trust fund I set up when you were born. I never had the right to keep it from you." Sarah took the envelope but didn't open it. "Money isn't what I wanted from you." "I know that too," he replied. "But maybe you can use it to help more people." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Your mother did an amazing job raising you." The Foundation continued to grow. Sarah and Elena worked side by side, helping other immigrant families understand their workplace rights. The small break room where Sarah had first discovered her missing wages was now a classroom where teenage workers learned to check their paychecks and stand up for themselves. 1 year after the verdict, Sarah received an unexpected call. Sterling was dying of pancreatic cancer. He had one request: to meet with her one last time. In his hospital room, Sterling looked nothing like the powerful billionaire who had once seemed untouchable. "I've spent this year watching everything you've built," he told her. "You turned my biggest mistake into something beautiful." Sarah sat with him until the end, not as a daughter forgiving her father, but as someone who understood that justice and healing could take many forms. At the 2-year anniversary of the Foundation's opening, Sarah unveiled a new program named after Elena, providing support for single mothers working to build better lives for their children. "Sometimes justice isn't about punishment," Sarah told a reporter. "It's about transformation. We turned anger into action, pain into purpose." The Young Workers' Rights Foundation became a model for similar organizations across the country. The wage theft that Sterling had used to build his fortune now funded programs protecting the very workers he had once exploited. Elena often found Sarah sitting in her office late at night, looking at the photo of her younger self standing up in court. "Do you ever regret learning the truth about him?" she asked her daughter. Sarah shook her head. "The truth set thousands of people free, Mom. Not just me." The Foundation's motto, displayed prominently in its lobby, read, "Justice grows from seeds of truth." Below it hung a simple time card, Sarah's first piece of evidence that had started it all. The story of the teenage cashier who brought down a billionaire and discovered her own heritage became legend. But for Sarah Chen, the real victory wasn't in exposing Sterling's secrets or winning millions in damages. It was in creating a legacy of her own, built on helping others stand up for what was right.